Good evening. Hi. Welcome. My name is Eric Siegel. I am Director of Education here at the museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the museum this evening for a talk that I'm very much looking forward to. Tonight's lecture is presented as part of the Harn Eminent Scholar Chair in Art History program, which is organized out of the School of Art and Art History here at UF in collaboration between the school and the Harn. It's a vehicle that really does a great job of bringing the museum and the school closer together in the pursuit of exploring the arts and enriching students' experience here at the museum. Established by a gift by David A. and Mary Ann Coffrin, the lecture series presents talks by eminent art historians, art critics, museum professionals, and artists. HESCAH has been, as I say, an important vehicle for bringing us together and allowing us to work together, and I'm very grateful for it. Tonight's lecturer will be introduced by my colleague, the director, the chief curator, that's the title, the chief curator here at the Harn and curator of modern art, Dulce Roman. So please join me in welcoming Dulce Roman to introduce our speaker.
Welcome to the Harn, everyone. I see a lot of familiar faces and friends and students. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for this program in conjunction with the exhibition Under the Spell of the Palm Tree, the Rice Collection of Cuban Art, which is on view in the main exhibition hall through January 7th. As you can see from the title of tonight's lecture, Professor Rachel Weiss will speak about the artistic collaborative group Los Carpinteros. And I should point out that the Harn Museum has a large work by Los Carpinteros that is currently on view in the Coffin Pavilion, the Contemporary Gallery. The title is Complejo Martí. And you'll have an opportunity to see it as well as the exhibition Under the Spell of the Palm Tree tonight, because the galleries will stay open until 9 p.m. And this program will be followed by a reception in the Harn Galleria. And now it's my honor to introduce tonight's speaker. Rachel Weiss is Professor Emerita of the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Following many years teaching and serving as chair of the Arts Administration and Policy Department, she is now based on the East Coast in the Hudson Valley. She is a prolific writer and has published extensively on contemporary art in journals, magazines, newspapers in the US, Europe, Latin America, Asia, and Australia. She is the author of key publications on Latin America. Her most recent book, unless there's another one since then, is Now What? Quandaries of Art and the Radical Past, published in 2021 by Fordham University Press. Additional books by Professor Weiss include Making Art Global, the Third Havana Biennial, published by After All Books in association with the Academy of Fine Arts Vienna in 2011, and To and From Utopia to the New Cuban Art, published by University of Minnesota Press in 2010. She is also editor of a volume of essays by the great artist and thinker Louis Kamnitzer, titled On Art, Artists, Latin America, and Other Utopias, published by University of Texas Press in 2009. As curator, she has helped shape the field of contemporary art, and by so doing has decentered canonical Western narratives. These projects include, together with Louis Kamnitzer and Jane Farber, the groundbreaking Global Conceptualism 1950s to 1980s Points of Origin at the Queens Museum of Art in New York City in 1999, and with co-curators Gerardo Mosquera and Carolina Ponce de Leon, the exhibition Ante America that opened in Bogota, Colombia in 1992 and traveled throughout South America, Central America, and North America. Tonight, Professor Weiss will speak about the Cuban artist collaborative group Los Carpinteros, who produced some of the most commented and lauded works to come out of Havana in the 1990s. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Rachel Weiss.
Thank you, Dulce and Eric. It's a pleasure to be here. Um, I have a cold, so if my voice like fades away, just somebody wave or let me know. I'll try to be consistent. Okay, so this talk is meant to sort of provide a little sense of what was going on in Cuba in the visual arts in the early 1990s, which was immediately following a very important period in Cuban contemporary art, the fabled 1980s, which was often called the New Cuban Art, and which which built the visibility that then created a market that created collections such as the one that's in the museum here. So, also, just keep in mind that Cuba was a kind of client state to the Soviet, what was then the Soviet Union, which began to undo itself around 1989 and which completely fell apart in 1991, and Cuba in tandem experienced collapse. So, Cuba was well on its way to crisis by the second half of the 1980s as the Soviet Union, which was its principal benefactor, began to collapse. Fidel Castro, of course, the longtime comandante since the revolution in 59, Fidel announced a process of what he called rectification of errors and negative tendencies. That was in 1986, in recognition of the calcification of the Cuban process. Rectification then would purge the nation of its ideological corruption and put it back onto the correct path. Young artists took Fidel at his word, and a cascade of critical and iconoclastic works issued forth, demanding in various ways just that kind of ethical renewal. It was an often raw work, improvisational, full of the humor and look of the Cuban streets, dismissive of the pieties as much as of the kind of promises, the unfulfilled promises of the revolutionary rhetoric. Those young artists' work magnetized a large and diverse following in Havana, which is very unusual for visual art. Probably you are aware of this. So it was visual art that was leading the way in raising for public discussion taboo subjects, such as corruption, dogmatism, cult of personality, lack of democracy, and so forth. For the most part, this work bypassed official circuits and acquired the status of renegade and, at least from an official perspective, counter revolutionary agitation. A routine of censorship and intimidation set in, and as tensions spiraled, most of those artists, most of an entire generation of artists, left the island in an emigration that was cynically facilitated by cultural authorities. So that this work that I'm describing was the direct antecedent to the Carpinteros and their cohort. So it may be useful to take a look at some key works. Several of them are by artists who are represented in the show here. As the wave of censorship spread throughout Havana galleries, Lázaro Saavedra made this piece, which he called Ideological Detector. The museum owns it and owned it since made it, but kept it in storage for many years. It was then later exhibited, and it might be on display now. So as you see, it reads from no problem through problematic, through two forms of counter-revolutionary, unconscious and then conscious, and then diversionist, which is the worst. The trademark says made in Cuba. Eduardo Ponjuan and Rene Francisco had a 1989 exhibition that they called Melodramatic Artist, and that raised the temperature considerably with its direct images of and commentary about Fidel Castro. It was generally understood that certain figures were taboo, including Fidel, Che Guevara, the national flag, things like that. Their exhibition catalyzed not only the closure of their exhibition by by the guy who was the head of the Communist Party's ideology section, but also the purging of the vice minister of culture. So that gives you a sense of the very high levels at which these young artists' work was being tracked and condemned. In this image, the Comandante appears in profile traced with bits of broken mirror under the word suicide. I think it's self explanatory. Glexis Novoa, who's actually not, I don't believe, in the exhibition here. Oh, is he? Oh, right. Yeah, yeah. Okay. This is from a series he did around 1990, I think, called Etapa Practica, Practical Stage, which followed work that he had done, which was called Etapa Romantica, is a romantic stage. The romantic stage was very expressive and ugly, and the practical stage looked like this. Um, Sort of the epitome of Soviet communist monumentalism. The walls covered with images of painted banners, brutalist architectural forms, and these sharply snapped vanishing points. These bravura cardboards, and it's worth pointing out the sort of poor materials that were being used, which was both a response to material possibility and also a statement of a sort of anti commodity practice. So these cardboards extolled something unknowable since what appears to be Cyrillic was actually fake. Um, it suggested, as I understood it, a nation both exaggerated and unsubstantiated with its corrupt ornamentalism. It turned the markers of socialism into simple pattern. It was hopelessly equivocal, even while it was unmistakable, to some at least. Um, the year before, in a hilarious version of Viennese actionism, Glexis had ripped out what were obviously fake guts he had stuffed into his Led Zeppelin t shirt. He explained that they really liked metal, even though nobody understood the lyrics. They just liked the sense of it. And inside the guts was a copy of Revolución y Cultura, which was the main publication of the Ministry of Culture at the time. And then finally, Tania Bruguera, a version of this piece is in the galleries. During the Havana Biennial in 1997, she performed this work, which she called El Peso de la Culpa, or The Burden of Guilt, at her home in Old Havana, standing before a large flag, a Cuban flag that was made entirely of human hair, and with a lamb carcass hung around her neck. She very solemnly mixed Cuban soil with water and salt, so obviously suggestive of tears, silently and methodically eating the mud over a period of around 45 really excruciating minutes. The action recalled historical accounts according to which indigenous people in Cuba at the time of the conquest vowed to eat dirt and nothing else rather than to be the captives of the Spanish conquistadors. It would be hard to overstate the extremity of the situation around the turn of the 1980s. The environment for art and artists boomeranged in the space of really just a few years, from an energy of participatory, energetic critique to a sense of gloom, fear, and closure, with an entire generation of artists forced from their homes and families, and the next generation left essentially as orphans. So then to Los Carpinteros. I'll give you a minute to. Los Carpinteros made replicas, ridiculous ones, thwarted ones, redundancies, tautologies, sarcastic facsimiles of things that, in their doubling, became pointless. Taken as a whole, it was a body of work devoted to failure. In what follows, I'll explore a couple of their monuments to dreams that no longer worked. First, that of modernity, and within that, the complicated relation between one kind of modernity, namely architecture and urbanism, and another, namely revolution. And second, the dream of Latin America. I'll argue that their willful and almost aggressive reclamation of visuality in the wake of work such as what we've just been looking at, and also their reclamation of craft, set up a conflicting set of meanings and repercussions, a hall of mirrors in which progress and regress crossed paths, in its replicating both a hearkening to and a rebuke of various pasts and their ideals. So, part one, the saga of ruination. As Soviet subsidies were withdrawn and the national economy imploded, a recovery strategy was devised based on the development of tourism, the opening to foreign investment, and the creation of a small business sector. Art became a natural arena for all three, and conditions of détente soon emerged between artists and institutions early in the 1990s. The skeptical generation that came of age in those years, not old enough to be implicated fully in the former period, but present at its demise, and not young enough to be formed free of its shadow. They stayed home, kept their heads down, and sold their work for dollars to the foreign clientele that came streaming into Cuba for sand, sex, and/or art. Art became all of a sudden, it seemed, beautiful once again, and artists displayed mastery. Such moves correlated well with the ready market at hand and the uncertain but bleak political atmosphere. This embrace of visuality was also defended as a rejection of the grand illusion that had been so definitive in the previous decade, namely that of political agency or the aspiration for it, as inherent to art. Part two, the condition of the city. Three caustically synchronous conditions mapped Havana in the early 1990s as Los Carpinteros were setting out. The daily collapse of one or another building, often with residents still inside. A historic preservation program in the city's colonial center, and the inauguration of dozens of new museums. This is the Museum of Firefighters. The city's precipitous decline and selective reinvention brewed in the toxic mix of economic crisis and revolutionary exhaustion, and split in two over a dividing line made of dollars. The artist's work has often sounded an uncanny echo of this situation in a variety of directions. In December 1994, in the depths of the crisis, what was called the Master Plan for the Revitalization of Old Havana was released, revealing the restoration operation as what the historian Anthony Capsia has called a vast commercial, artistic, and archaeological historical project on a scale which had never been imagined. The program generated a network of training establishments that produced young specialists to perform the restoration work, re-establishing the status of those various artisanal skills. Los Carpinteros' lauding of the artisan must, then, be seen in the context of, even if not necessarily in tandem with, the Cuban government's own re-estimation of artisanal value. The outlying neighborhood where the trio was attending the Higher Institute of Art had been one of the city's grandest, home to mansions and a country club that, following a vision of Che Guevara, seen there, next to Fidel Castro, had been transformed into the campus of the National Art School. And this is a view of the visual arts section of it. It was an extraordinary project that got aborted halfway through for complicated reasons. Los Carpinteros' earliest works were made with decorative bits and pieces raided from those then abandoned mansions, and their colonial style paintings mimicked the bourgeois tastes of pre-revolutionary elites. At the same time, and in desperation, People across the city were routinely recycling whatever they could, using it or selling it on the street. And so, while the material grandeur of Los Carpinteros' artworks rankled against the revolutionary egalitarian ethos and the kind of dour rationalism that had guided Soviet aesthetics, their work was also consonant in a perverse kind of way with the scavenging and improvisation undertaken by so many others in the name of pure survival. Los Carpinteros, in other words, developed a body of work or a look that was perfectly concentric to its historical and situational moment in a way that was brilliantly calibrated to appeal to circles beyond that local enclosure. And what I mean by that is that the audience for the work in the 80s had been very much a local audience, and all of a sudden it was playing, the Cuban art was playing to buyers from outside. Part 3, the replica. The replica is, in a way, the realm of pure craft. It's a vehicle par excellence for bravura displays of craftsmanship, since, for one thing, its success is measured by the closeness of its resemblance. The mimetic object has no identity of its own, no proper content or meaning beyond that of what it reproduces. So the means by which it's made takes on added significance. Its objectness or its materiality, its form, absorbs the force that might otherwise arise from its content. And this is very polemical, obviously. These are assertions which, if taken too generally, would be pretty precarious. But I think they become very acute in the case of Los Carpinteros. The replica was an excellent solution to the various pressures and conundrums that they faced. In their hands, the replica repeated the beautiful things: hope, progress, ideals, and in that repeating, found immunization against the vulnerabilities they had been known to inflict. In place of the sarcastically repurposed political icons, and this is a painting by Tomas Esson of the Cuban flag as severed meat, basically. So, and this is from late 1980s. In place of work like this, Los Carpinteros doubled a different, often more quotidian set of icons in minimizing the space of commentary. Therefore, their replica was a safe comment. The replica was also good for another problem raised by the period, namely that of the increased need for translation due to the shift from a mostly local to an almost entirely foreign audience. The replica, with its quick legibility and extroverted display of value, presented a fine response to those circumstances. So, part 4, FOXA. This building is known as the FOXA building, which stands for Fomento de Obras y Construcciones. This building went up in the heart of the Vedado district of Havana between 1954 and 1956, an object of wonder, both for being one of the largest reinforced concrete structures in the world at the time, and for having been raised with incredible speed and with the assistance of a computer, a first on the island. Foxa is visible from many parts of the city and provides unparalleled panoramic views. Its unusual footprint was often likened to a gigantic open book, and over the years it came to be seen as a prime example of what was called the wave of advanced modernity that engulfed Havana during the 50s. These quotes are from HavanaArchitecture.com. The Edificio Foxa, they say, represents Havana's becoming, Havana's booming economy and foreign influence at the time. This 35-story complex was conceived and based on Corbusian ideas of a self-contained city within a city. It was the ultimate symbol of luxury. In 2002, Los Carpinteros copied it in the form of a giant cabinet. In their version, which was part of an extensive series of works, the building's cement is substituted with the pleasing glow of expertly burnished wood surfaces. and its inner skeleton is replaced by a smooth grid of drawers. Those drawers, in place of the transparency of Folks's walls of windows, form a cancelled, depopulated facade, punctuated at regular intervals by simple round knobs. The object is striking for the cool elegance of its manufacture, in which highly crafted facades and mechanisms share a discreetly understated visuality. Its overall surface neutrality and tonal consistency lend their Folksa a strangely blank presence, conjuring nothing so much as the aesthetic of Danish modern furniture. It's that resemblance which energizes the work's clever play on scale. The cabinet is Lilliputian in relation to the building it echoes, yet it's too large to occupy one of its actual domestic interiors. So it's an impossible object, which refuses to function in any sensible way, an eerily silent evocation of the turmoil that had swirled through Havana at mid-century. Folksa went up during the heyday of the gambling, hustling, dictatorial old days of the city. The post-war period had been a time of relative prosperity in Havana for some, but much of the wealth that was generated was either invested abroad, hoarded, or used for real estate construction and speculation. Folksa, along with other major building projects at the time, was built with private investment. It was, in other words, the output of exactly the business class that the dictator Batista was keeping Cuba safe for. Folksa was the product of Cuba's brief period of high modernism, and in that, the product of social and political dynamics that gave way or even fomented the revolution. Oh, I thought that might be mine, sorry. Okay, so even fomented the revolution. It cannot be a coincidence that the Carpinteros Folksa was likewise built in a moment of ascendant tourism in the city, the other bookend moment to that interval during which the revolutionary ideals of Cuba for the Cubans had held sway. But Folksa has an even wider set of associations and affiliations, stretching beyond those of the rich period of modernity in Havana and its complicated and tense relation with the modernity that had been brought by the revolution. Once the revolution came, Folksa was used as lodging for thousands of students on scholarships, hundreds of foreign technicians, and cadres of Cuban doctors, nurses, and other health specialists before they left to provide their collaboration to other lands of the world, in other words, the internationalist project of the Cuban Revolution. Folksa was also, more notoriously, made home for the many Soviet specialists sent to the island and who, as one historian has put it, actively contributed to the building's premature dereliction. Folksa was one of the things that Los Carpinteros decided to replicate. And in the spring of 2002, just as they were making their copy, it was announced that repairs to the building would finally be undertaken after 20 years of trying to get that to happen by foreign companies. Their replica was twin to the actual tower's restoration. The identifications of modernism are incredibly complex and contradictory in Cuba. Cuba's so-called stylistic backwardness was in some ways synonymous with its colonial status under Spain, so modernism and republic coincided. Modernism in architecture was therefore closely associated with the continual project of defining or realizing lo cubano. But this was in itself a highly contradictory proposition. The republic was a thwarted independence, a trading of Spanish for U.S. domination. And so even if the family to which Folksa belongs was considered international, nonetheless it was a case of an acritical adoption of the international style disseminated from the U.S. Remaking Folksa, then, invoked this entire litany. It both parallels and mocks the reglorification of the colonial heritage, It revisits the wildly divergent ideals and beneficiaries of local modernism, and it resuscitates what was at once both an odd revolutionary icon and simultaneously opposite. Modernism is linked with the idea of originality, so copying a modernist icon is a snide retort to that central claim of the movement, along with its linked veneration of progress. In Folksa, modernism had been taken under the revolution's wing, but not for long. Folksa, standing there on the horizon, was a reminder of why the revolution happened and how it proceeded, and its lapse into dereliction was no less resonant. Los Carpinteros Folksa is a monument to a multiply collapsed modernity, one lost dream obscured by another, the sundered dream of revolution. So, part 5, the creating hand. If their version of Folksa had traveled the contorted paths along with architectural and revolutionary modernism that intersected, Los Carpinteros' copy of this work, Juan Francisco Elso's 1988 La Mano Creadora, The Creating Hand, ricocheted off a very different utopia. This work, like their Folksa, is from the series of cabinets and shares the trope of a surface broken into carefully articulated compartments. Unlike the modernist aesthetic that guided the other box, though, this one's lines trace the irregular creases of a hand and break its recesses into jagged and shallow spaces. Juan Francisco Elso had always worked from within a profound spiritual vision, as much informed by historical dreams of continental unity and independence as by Cuban and Mesoamerican popular religious traditions. His works, although very few in number, possess an uncanny force. Perennially at odds with the cultural administration and mostly sidelined by it, Elso had left for Mexico, the first in what became a flood of emigres, although his departure was for reasons of marriage rather than politics. Once in Mexico, he had begun work on a trilogy called La Transparencia de Dios, The Transparency of God, of which his creating hand was a part. Elso died of leukemia in 1988 at the age of 32, before being able to complete the ensemble, and both he and it have since been anointed with a kind of saintly penumbra. In remaking Elso's hand, Los Carpinteros cast themselves as apprentices, juniors in the guild who learn by copying the works of the master, and though this, I think, seems a little suspect, also acolytes in his charismatically incomplete spiritual quest. Elso's hand was the hand of God, caught in the moment of creation. Huge and delicate, it was painstakingly assembled using supremely fragile materials: dry twigs, volcanic sand, jute fiber, beeswax, and straw. To make objects out of such stuff suggests a precarious life for them, which seemed both fitting and surprising in light of the extreme care that Elso took with each tiny detail. Above all, the work is imbued with meditative and ritual overtones, suggesting an intimate codependence between the meaning, the material, and the method. The hand was part of this larger work. In addition to it, there was the face of God, and you entered from within the face of God, so you saw the rest through those eyes. And there was also the heart of America, which is the background here. There was also to have been an image of Simon Bolivar brandishing the sky, as he put it. Altogether, the works would have covered a vast range, from Nahua systems of knowledge to the great dream of Bolivar, to the great liberator of an emancipated America. Even though incomplete, what is left to us of it is an astonishing inquiry into history, spirituality, and self, wrought as an intensely located discourse. Elso's hand is crisscrossed with lines which are punctured by wounds, that spurt straw sheaves of blood. Among those wounds is one that breaks the palm's lifeline, and this, in view of his status as an initiate of Santeria, has led to various assertions that the artist somehow invoked his own death in the act of creating. These lines in Los Carpinteros' hand become the frames of drawers, containers in the style of an advent calendar full of delightful little secrets. The original was made in an act of utmost desire and from an intuition of death. It is poised on the edge of the chasm into which the new Cuban art fell, made just before things started to fall apart. So we have then two copies, twins of a sort, made in exactly the same way, with exactly the same materials, structural logic, visual vocabulary, level of finish and craft, though it's already becoming clear that their inversions of the originals point in widely divergent directions. These collude and overlap, but do not coincide. They repeat, but in fragments. So let's take a look. The replica is camouflage. It was not only that the political climate made audacity seem unwise, it was also a time in which forceful convictions got hopelessly tangled in contradictions. Basic survival, for the first time in decades, demanded constant attention and insinuated itself into direct competition with the yearnings for change, for liberation, for making history that the revolution had once brought. Los Carpinteros' camouflage was perfect. It was, first of all, perfect as an aesthetic strategy. They began work at a time when an international market for Cuban art had already been jump-started, and they understood how to capitalize on that through continuity and how to extend it through rupture. And so the work still read as Cuban. It was, after all about Cuba. It kept the caustic signature of the earlier generation, but it restyled it all into a kind of bejeweled vulgate that looked a lot more like something worth spending money on. The simultaneous nostalgia for and burlesque of artisanry was not only that, it was an ironic seduction that took market swings into account. Their camouflage was perfect in political terms. The work's subjects resonated as substantial, pointed, even transgressive sometimes, but this was always aimed carefully. While it had bite in relation to, for instance, Cuban modernism, its suggestiveness regarding anything closer to the present moment was diffuse. Camouflage allowed the artist to move through a difficult, even hostile landscape and avoid any detection that could be dangerous. Within this, we could reconsider their persona as a guild of craftsmen, as Marco Castillo, who is one of the group, explained. He said they were producing, quote, labor, not ideas. These are not the provocateurs of former years. Again, quoting Castillo, to identify ourselves with the sense of a guild put us in an ambiguous territory between the artist and artisan, between a profession bearing ideology and another that is apparently devoid of social responsibility. Their camouflage was perfect in psychological terms. It enabled them, because the replica of Elso really does seem to be earnest, at least somehow, it enables them to displace. In reprising one of the most ambitious and emotionally complex works of contemporary Cuban art, they did clearly still insist on importance for art and on the importance of the legacy that they inherited. The works invite a psychoanalytic mood with their constant inversions and displacements of functions, their literalization of dream fragments. Later on, they did a series of works that were frozen explosions, for example. But the works are told in the register of the joke rather than the analysand's confessional distress. What to make of the unequivocal craftsmanship in view of the work's resounding ambiguity? What to make of the impeccable objects alongside the incessant need to improvise rudimentary solutions and repairs? Not only was everyone scavenging, they were also inventing. and their handmade contraptions stepped in to replace the now vanished mass produced goods. Artisanal skills were indeed lauded by the city historian because they made old buildings come back to life to the delight of tourists. But artisanal skills, especially the most vital one of imagination, were living a robust new life throughout the city, far from those well funded zones. Los Carpinteros made handsome handmade objects just like everybody else. It's almost breathtaking how perfectly tuned their work was to that time, a clever representation and echo of the conditions, with a distance. In their work, the situation was mostly ridiculous, not tragic. The replica is a tautology. Literalization disbands the horizon. It's well equipped to manage disillusionment. The handmade, ready made implies a fetishization of the lost original. The replica defuses the original and undoes it. With Foxa, the artist had taken a structure whose significance lay in the method of its construction, material paragon of the moment of high modernity in Cuba, and refashioned its industrial progress as handmade cabinets. Their Foxa is a model, a scaled down version of a very large and powerful idea. It's a toy. It reverses the building's technological breakthroughs, makes them the markers of a doubtful advance, or at least a highly conflicted one, and denies their durability. Their Foxa takes those arrogant aspirations down a peg and writes their hubris as silliness. It turns the spectacle of a Cuba on its knees to foreign values, foreign money, into the coquetry of those who have learned how to work those outside sources of revenue. In the case of the hand, they took a work that was also the opposite of theirs, but in the other direction, because Elso's hand had been the epitome of his willfully artisanal method of fabrication. Los Carpinteros' craft is that of colonial and neocolonial status. Elso's was of peasants. Elso had been inspired by folk constructions he saw in the Mexican countryside and by the sensibility and practice of Santeria. When the Carpinteros remake it, they preserve it as legacy. They polish, they adorn, but they leave aside the work's mythical stature. As in their Foxa, Los Carpinteros' hand inverts the material register of the original, substituting for the precarity of twigs and twine the planes and precision of an exquisite box. Reproducing Foxa was a matter of linear logic, the industrial original wholly compatible with its own recreation, but Elso's hand is singular by virtue of its spiritual and ritual status. So to copy it means to copy not it, but its ghost. The representation of Foxa is correspondent, but the representation of the hand knows that it's presenting something entirely apart from the original. It's more like a cargo cult. This is the dystopian or even anti-utopian side of their work. Los Carpinteros' replicas are very lovely but not at all loving. They have bones to pick with those old horizons. The deployment of beauty is key here, and corrosive. The exquisite craft is indissolubly linked to beauty, and it's that beauty which becomes the central text of the copy. Craft is thus the way that this dismantling is carried out. The beautiful double suspends the dream rather than working on it. It's a hypertrophied resemblance, crafted in a climate that renders overstylization as ethically neutral, in which tautology is no longer a dirty word. These are works of double exile, profoundly estranged from their home context, and, although produced there, directed to a viewer who is far removed. Under these conditions, critique can easily proceed without criticality, since the revolutionary horizon has been left out of the copy. Utopia itself becomes tautology only able to write itself. Theirs is a decline argument. The issue of beauty arises as a consequence of negative factors: an anxious heritage, an imploded horizon, a social sphere deadlocked in desperate capitalism, and psychosocial collapse. Los Carpinteros' art, above all, was a bruised reply to the 1980s with its art of durable purpose, commitment, and social trust. Their early work was shocking for the contrast to what it seemed to echo. The replica, it turns out, looks very much like what was at the time called the New Capitalism. This may seem strange at first since we're talking about a socialist nation, but let's remember the matter of double exile. The intensity of the handmadeness lies in maximizing its presence. Here we're reminded of terms like reskilling and upskilling, which was the language of New Capitalism. In order to understand this convergence, we need to return one more time to the 1980s. Art's rejection of technique, or what was called de-skilling, was closely associated with a critique of the art market, and in the case of Cuba, with a rejection of the state's marshaling of art into ideologically directed promotional platforms. Related to that rejection, it set up an oppositional relation between visuality and concept. The new art was essentially formed of ideas, this new art meaning the 1980s, not manual skill, and in order to advance and certify its own radicality, it went so far as to recast that skill as anathema. This anti authorial art shifted much of the weight of artistic experience onto the viewer in a consciously political move. The subsequent restoration of art's auratic status opposed this defiant de-skilling and amounted to a repurposing of that aura away from the sublime and into the fungible. But there's a geographic aspect to this situation in addition to a material one. A tourist economy was a key marker of the new capitalism, which looked everywhere for new sites but without ever attaching to them. This indifference to place, like the condition of double exile, mirrored the vital mobility of what was called flexible capitalism. Increasingly through the 1990s, artists in Cuba became intensely estranged from precisely the conditions and circumstances that had been so definitive for Cuban art in its earlier manifestation. Economic opportunity, the availability of travel and communication, in other words, mobility and connection, the hallmarks of globalization. The location of the expression matters no more than the location of the consumer, and in this we can find inklings of Los Carpinteros' ambivalent relation to Cubanía. In relation to that other space, the dream space of a liberated continent, there's expansion into a borderless condition. The dream is now that of being what was at the time called an international artist, which is an almost embarrassing term, but one that was nonetheless used in the most sophisticated press releases. The question of nostalgia is unavoidable, although perplexing. This is obviously a work drenched in nostalgia, which might be the most labyrinthine sentiment of all, and certainly one of the most kitsch. On the most basic level, the reskilling revivalism was a nostalgic move, caught between a time of intensity, power, and clear and certain meanings, and one of irreferentiality. In addition to the Folksa and Hand, Los Carpinteros series included others, like a prison, a hand grenade, which they named Jewelry Box, and the Soviet embassy, which is probably the worst building in Havana. They even staged echoes of echoes, as, for example, in their tent version of the Havana Capitolio, which is kind of in the middle ground there, itself a copy of the Capitol building in the US Capitol. There is here a compulsion to repeat. Such a compulsion often arises from conditions like incompleteness, unrequitedness, and nostalgia. Repetition is the ghost of unfulfilled desire. The replicas are simulacra, they're voided copies, vessels brimming with nostalgia instead. What were the fates of the originals that the artists copied? The politics of Fox's time were over in both their iterations. One set of dreams corrupted at their core, overthrown by another, that in turn yielded its own nightmare. The new wealth of the 1990s was in some ways an even harsher version than that of the colonial mansions, not least for having been brewed in disappointment. The artist's luxurious objects were intentionally obscene within the local context, setting the ground for a tense dynamic between that context and those who would admire those objects. It's a work of cynicism at several levels: cynical about Cuba, about art, about success, and if this is possible, cynical about its own cynicism, its ability to set such a beguiling, elaborate trap. Carefully, shrewdly, acidly, Los Carpinteros replicated the material residues of ideas exploding with hope, modernity, spirituality, culture, although they assiduously avoided that most obvious container of hope in the Cuban context, that of revolution. In the Havana of Los Carpinteros' early years, material experience had become more pronounced in at least a couple of mutually jarring ways: widespread decay and fantastic enrichment, both of them featuring prominently in the ethical morass of the time. The objects of Los Carpinteros, I think, embody both, though perhaps opting finally for the latter. Thank you.